It's 2 o'clock, and I call the meeting for the Ames City Council for Friday, the 29th of January order. Welcome, everybody. This is our first foray into the budget, and this meeting is being held electronically as allowed by the Code of Iowa due to the ongoing COVID pandemic, and you can access it if you're interested online by going to the City of Ames website and go under Government, City Council, Mayor, and the meetings, and you can find the hot link and also a toll-free number if you wish to join that way. So, only have a couple items on the agenda, and the big one is review of the budget. So, I'm going to turn over to Dwayne and to Nancy or to Steve.
Yeah, why don't I start off to give a brief overview. I want to thank the Mayor and Council for giving us the opportunity to actually unveil the operating budget for fiscal year 21-22, which starts July 1st. The staff has been working diligently since August, believe it or not, to put this particular document together. It is more than just a financial plan. It is actually a plan for the service levels we're going to perform and provide to the citizens of Ames from all the different departments who provide service to our citizens. As you might imagine, this was a very unusual year. It's always a challenge to put the budget together, but we're in the throes of COVID-19, which made it uncharted waters for us. We, like many of your own homes and maybe your businesses, were impacted substantially by the existence of this pandemic. You'll see as we go through, specific areas were impacting negatively. If you look at the general fund, think about the participation levels that have dropped in parks and recreation because of a requirement to shut down our facilities, our social distances. So we were hit with a substantial loss in recreation revenue that was budgeted and not received this year. That's in the general fund. I think you'll notice also in our park development fund, that's been somewhat drawn down because of increases in cost of projects. I also want to tell you about the parking fund. You can imagine what COVID did there because it had a devastating effect on our Main Street and Campus Town areas. People weren't going to shop, so obviously our revenue is down there to a point it's in danger of putting us in a negative balance in that fund. And we'll deal with that and explain how we dealt with that in the budget also. And then in the hotel motel tax, you can imagine what's happened there. And not only does it affect us in terms of our operating budget, it has a devastating effect on our Ames Convention and Visitor Bureau, which we contract with to perform those necessary and vital recruitment efforts to bring visitors to this community, which helps our economy. And we'll have something to say about how we're going to handle that particular area. So with the face of that and knowing that, remember I came to you months and months ago to talk about a financial plan or strategy to try to help offset this loss in revenue. And what we did, we took some extraordinary efforts. I won't go through all of them, but if you remember, we curtailed any kind of travel and conferences for the year, if you'll recall that. In many cases, we did not hire any temporary staff. Probably the most important one we did was we froze vacant positions. Substantial number were actually in the general fund, where we had maybe 15 or 16 police and fire positions open that we held open for perhaps 9 months until we finally filled them just recently. So that generated savings. We did that in all the funds, not just the general fund, to help us through the pandemic. And finally, I ask all the department heads, who I trust immensely, to try to hold the line on expenditures as much as they could and delay expenditures. And they did an excellent job of that. We've done such an excellent job, I think you'll see that we generated some excess revenue, that I'm confident we're going to be able to weather the storm of COVID that hit us back in fiscal year 1920, that actually started in April of that year. It's taking us through this particular year, and we're generating some excess revenue for the general fund, which I'll give you a list of by recommended expenditures for one-time expenditures to use this particular funding, the availability. I want to thank the department heads, because as we prepare next year's budget, the 21-22, I wanted their cooperation again. The goal was to help maintain the same level of service, but hold the line on expenditures as much as possible. And when Dwayne goes over the numbers, you'll see this particular budget that I'm recommending is asking for $590,000 additional tax revenue for next year to fund all the departments who are funded by the general fund. That's only 1.8% increase over the prior year. That's a very, I think, a good indication of how well the departments did in holding the line on their budgets. Many times, if you've been with me, I've been up to $2 million incremental request. Many times, and most of the times, it's over $1 million we're asking for additional each year in the general fund operating expenditures. So I think they've done a wonderful job in cooperating with this. They understand the seriousness of this. We tried to start the fiscal year, this next fiscal year. We understand how difficult it's been on everyone's families and businesses. We tried to approach it. We were going to try as much as we could to mitigate the impact of property taxes on the families and residents, businesses of this community, and also try to hold the line on any utility rate increases. We understand everybody is having a challenging year. I think we've done a good job. We'll go over that. You'll see just a minor out-of-pocket expense net to the residential customers in this town on the property taxes. You'll see actual decreases, and I'm talking about out-of-pocket decreases, not just rate decreases, for commercial and industrial property owners. Of all the utilities we operate, we're only asking for a rate increase in the water fund, and actually it's 2% less than we projected last year at this time for the coming year. Otherwise, no increases in any of our utilities. And finally, you'll see very few fee increases built in. Now, Parks and Rec, those fees are established by the Parks and Rec Commission, and we try to have nominal increases each year, so we don't have to have one big bump after 5 years. But other than that, you'll notice our building fees will stay the same, our rental housing fees will stay the same, and most of the other fees will stay the same for the city of Ames. We're not building in any major fee increases to support the budget. Over the next 5 meetings we're going to provide you with a lot of background information, not only for the financial side, but when the departments come before you, they're going to tell stories of the levels of service and the service we're providing to this community, which is an important aspect of the budget, as I mentioned. So we hope we keep this informal. I'm sure you'll interrupt us as we go. We've never done this since I've been here on Zoom. We've had Zoom council meetings, but never had a budget meeting before. So I don't want people to feel intimidated this way. Hopefully we can interact. There's plenty of time for the citizens to give you input into the operating budget as well as the capital improvements plan. You won't be making your final decision until Tuesday, February 9th. We'll have all the documents, the capital improvements plan, the operating budget, and all the supplemental information we're going over today and throughout the next week is on the internet, okay, and under our website. So everybody have access to that information. So with that a little bit of background, I want to turn it over to Dwayne, I think, to start off and go through some of the supplemental information that provides the background of the proposed budget.
Thanks, Steve. And as Steve had mentioned, this is a little bit different format this year with the Zoom. So we're going to adjust our presentation just a little bit to make it fit in a little bit better with this format. So all the documents, as Steve mentioned, are out on the web. So the entire budget document is out there, and that'll be the detail that we cover next week. What we call special reports to the budget, which has a lot of detailed analysis, that's also included. We typically would go over that page by page, but I don't think that's going to fit in quite as well with this format. So that's available to pull up on our screen if any council member has a question on that as we go through. But for the most part, we're going to stick with PowerPoint presentation, which is a summary of the items that are both in the budget and that special reports book. So if you have any questions as we go along about specific pages, we can pull those up and discuss them. But otherwise, we're going to go with the more overview that fits on the PowerPoint. It'll be a little bit easier to follow for those that are participating through Zoom out in the public. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll start going through that. And this PowerPoint is out on the web also. Okay, again, we're talking about a budget overview for FY 21-22. That's the year that's going to start this coming July 1st. And we always pick a budget theme. And this year, you know, we talked about a theme of the big things that were going on, and they were the derecho and the COVID pandemic. But we really focused on the city response to those two items. So you'll see that as we go through the book. I mean, all our departments, as well as the public, have played a big role in the responding to both of those pretty unprecedented events that happened here in Ames over the past year. So as far as tax rates, we'll be talking today primarily about the property tax rate. We'll hit some other items, as Steve mentioned, for the city of Ames. But just as a reminder, the consolidated tax bill that goes out to all the property owners, that's made up of several different components, the largest of which is the school district. About a third of that is the City of Ames tax bill, and you see that on a pie graph here. This is based on Ames School, and Ames School District, City of Ames. Obviously, we have a fair amount of the cities within the Gilbert School District. When that's the case, their district is a little bit higher piece of the pie, or larger piece of the pie, and the city's a little bit smaller. So about a third of the taxes, and that's been that way for years. We don't expect that to change too much. Just kind of big picture, some of the items we're going to go over in a lot more detail, but some of the bigger items of note this year, the property tax rate, or the rate per thousand, the levy rate, will be down 27 cents from the prior year. Both taxable and assessed value are up for all major classes of property, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. There's a modest increase in total tax dollars, and most property taxpayers will see a reduction or a less than 1% increase in their property tax bills. And again, we'll go over that in a little bit more detail. The budget includes balance for general fund for both operations and capital. That means we won't spend, we're not budgeted to spend any more money than we'll take in. We're forecasting a 4% growth in local option sales tax revenue. And we think that's a good, fair forecast, even with everything going on. And as Steve mentioned, the only utility rate increase will be for water. There will be some revenue increase in resource recovery, and that's related to the same per capita rate applied to a new census, which we expect to go up. We talked about that property tax rate going down 27 cents. I've got a little bit more detail on the next slide. But this just provides the information on where it's going. It's down, and I'm going to try to use, I don't have as much of a pointer here. There's that rate that's going from 1014 or 1015 down to about 987. And here's the total amount of dollars that generates, about $32,408,000. And we've got some more detail on that levy this next slide. There's a lot of numbers here. So if there's any that we have questions on, big picture wise, we have taxable value up 4.7%. That's up here. Our total expenses are up, as I mentioned, a modest amount, about $590,000 or 1.85%. So the value that we spread the costs across is up significantly more than the expenses. So that means that we're able to lower the rate. So it's going from $10.15 down to $9.87, or about 27 cents per thousand on value. I'll point out a few of our levies here. We make several different levies make up that total levy. The largest of which is the general levy. and that's at $5 and about 55 cents. That is subject to an 810 limit. Obviously, we're well under that, and that levy is down about 11 cents. The employee benefits levy, which for us is only the police and fire pension contribution, that one is up slightly. That's primarily due to the increase in that contribution rate. Also, wages are up a small amount, but the most of that's due to contribution rate. Transit held the line on expenses. The dollar contribution from the city will be exactly the same as last year. There's a little bit of a change in the state replacement tax, but all that combined, we'll actually see a reduction in that levy. And debt service, with the increase in the rate, and we're actually asking for less dollars. It's about 35,000 less. That portion of the levy is actually down about 15 cents. So those are all the levies that make up that reduction of 27 cents across the different levies. This is just a graphic showing some of the history of our levy rates over the last few years, and you can see as far back as 1718, we were at $10.38. The levy rate stayed in a pretty close range across several years, and then now has dropped down to projecting a $9.87 for the future year. If we look at the current year, 2021, it was at $10.15, and a lot of that was reflective of a fairly low increase in value that year. We were only up 1.1% in taxable value. This year being up 4.7%, and modest increase in expenses, we're actually lowering the rate by the fairly significant amount that we talked about. Another item that impacts our levy rate, I know we had talked about for years, kind of the either shrinkage or loss in retail sales, which a lot of that we believed was related to internet sales and not as much of the brick and mortar sales that were happening here locally. And as you know, the local option sales are the 1% that goes here. 60% of that goes directly to reduce property taxes. So the impact of that 60% of the 1% had, if you look back in 1920, that had dropped down to under $1.60. It had always been, if you look back in 1718, it had been up to $1.76. So that impact due to not always shrinking local option, but certainly not growing as fast as our population or the rate of inflation. We've seen that reversed in the last couple of years, and that is primarily due to the internet retail sales collecting local option sales tax. So we've seen a return of that, which certainly helps our budget. Another item that impacts it is the change in valuation. This goes back 10 years, and this is taxable values, so there's a lot of impact that goes on there. There's the change in the rollback rate, how much new property you have coming on, what we might have changed as far as revaluation of existing property. And as you can see, that rate of change in taxable valuation has been different in all these different years as you look back. Good news for us, it's always been positive. Last year was a fairly tough year with that at 1.1%, but this year at 4.7%. That's a positive for our budget. Now, the component of valuation where we spread those costs, the taxable costs across the different classes of property, we look at how that's changed from year to year. And, I think fairly good news this year. Every class of property, the major classes, residential, commercial and multi-residential, and industrial are all up both in taxable value and assessed value. Now, they're up by different percentages, but we've had years where we have one class goes up and one class goes down. And in that case, when you apply the taxes, you may see one class with a fairly significant increase in property taxes as that's spread out, while another class may get a decrease. Now, they are varying degrees this year, but they are all positive, which makes this more even as we distribute that property tax cost across the different owners. This just provides a graphic of our value over the years. We have both taxable and assessed value. And, it's not real significant growth, but the real thing to point out here is the trend over time, continues to march up at, a fairly steady and gradual rate. So it's, growth, I think what we always look at is growth that is controlled and can be absorbed within the services in our budget. So real fast growth gets hard to take care of, and slow growth actually means in a lot of cases higher taxes if you're going to keep services. This graphic breaks down the change in taxable value. So we were up 4.7% as we talked about that, and we'd like to look at this number, this 146 million. That's the total increase in taxable across the different classes of property. The biggest impact this year was new valuation. So that was property that's new to the system, didn't pay taxes last year. That's up $79 million, or about 2.57% increase. The other areas of large impact is the second biggest would be an adjustment due to rollback. So the rollback rate for residential property actually increased this year. So that has the effect of increasing the taxable value on the same property. So if you had a exact same property last year and nothing changed, the taxable value still goes up because of the change in the rollback rate. So the impact of that was about $37 million, but it doesn't hit all classes of property evenly. Then we also had a relatively small change, less than 1% of change due to increased valuation in existing properties. So when we look at these all together, it's almost 50-50. The change that's attributable to new valuation is about 54% of the change, and the change attributable to the existing property is about 66% of the change, or 45% of the change at $66 million. I will point out that the rollback is primarily in the residential property. Actually, when you look down here, the commercial and multi-residential, their rollback actually goes down, and that's reflective of multi-residential property moving through a process of rolling back to the residential rate, and also any changes of class between commercial and residential. So this just breaks out, where, and we'll get this in dollars, but where those changes are in valuation. We talked about one of our levies, one that was down 15 cents, and that was our debt service levy. And that's the breakout of that is right here at $2 and almost $3. And where does all that go? And we'll hit this a little bit more when we talk about where the tax dollars go. But you look at some areas up here like airport, that's listed. There's some expense there, but that's abated debt. It's paid for by an agreement, either that the airport will generate the revenue or an agreement with Iowa State. Fire apparatus, this is one where we've issued some debt for some new apparatus. Part of that's offset by Iowa State. You'll see that's an abatement. So, about 4 cents of that levy goes to fire apparatus, and so on. The largest one, of course, is streets. So that's debt for all the street improvements in the past, and then the new debt is primarily for street improvements for the future year, and you can see those projects that you saw in the CIP over here to the right. So that's a debt service, and you'll notice that we're not using any fund balance this year. So we could use some fund balance. We have some available, but one of the areas that we do some long-term planning on when we do our CIP is the impact of the debt service levy on the property taxpayers as we implement those projects going forward. So as you remember, we went over the CIP a couple weeks in January, those first two meetings, the workshop meeting and your regular meeting. And these are the amounts of debt that we have going out in the 5 years of the capital improvement plan. We also have outstanding debt that we need to consider. And then we look at what will that impact the rate for debt service levy going forward. And we try to even that out over the 5 years of the CIP. So you see this year we're at about $3. Next year, with a fairly modest growth in taxable value, will be a little bit over $3. The next year out, it goes up a little bit, and then up a little bit each of the year 4 and 5 of the CIP. But again, we've projected fairly modest growth, 3% in taxable value. If that's more than that, like years like now, or if we have a few years of that, that would bring these rates down. And I've also projected higher interest rates out in year 4 and 5. That may or may not be the case, but we think this is a fairly judicious use of that fund balance going forward. You could use it all this year, but then we'd be stuck raising the rates in future years. Another area of fund balance is police and fire fund balance. This goes clear back to 1992, and we've got a bigger spreadsheet that would be hard to see up on the screen that's included in the packet. But it shows how we've used different amounts of that excess balance, and that was available when we closed out a local pension to a combined statewide pension system. We had an excess amount. There was years when that rate went up substantially, or we made changes in the manning levels, and we spent down some of that balance. So obviously that's been years. That goes clear back to 1992. And we're getting to the point where we're kind of at the end of that balance. This year we're using $95,000. Next year's about $50,000. And we think we'll see that rate go up slightly. You can see that over here on the right. That's the levy rate for the police and fire contribution. However, I do have forecasted rates here for our contribution, but that's based on a 7.5% market return. And we know for the year that ended last year, we did okay. And so far this year, and you think about fiscal years, I expect these rates to go down a little bit going forward. Good news is these rates after 24, 25 should steadily decrease as that system is paying off its unfunded pension liability. So within the scope of our 5-year planning range, we should see that balance go down to 0. Next slide, we look at the total dollar value of the levy. So if you remember, we were levying about $32.4 million. So compared to last year, that's over here, we're up about $590,000 or 1.85%. That's off that previous slide. And we look at the different classes of property. So how is that spread across the classes, both in total taxes paid and the change in the dollar value of the levy? So for the residential class combined, that's all the residential property, they're up about $369,000 or 1.84, almost the exact same amount as the total increase in the property taxes. The commercial and multi-residential, and we'll go over this, where this comes from, is up about 2.67%. But remember, this includes both new property and changes to existing. Industrial, total as a class, is actually going to be down slightly, as will utilities and the TIF, which pays debt service only. We had an increase in TIF. That's up by about 1.75%. So total levy is up $590,000. This is how it's spread across the different classes of property. So who's paying that out of those existing classes of property? So residential, remember the total change was $369,000. Most of that is due to new property coming on the tax rolls. So that group would pay $313,586. Existing property, so everybody that paid taxes last year, they'll have impact on their tax rate due to rollback, due to change in valuation, But also the biggest item is that reduction in rate down to 27 cents. So that takes away essentially all these changes due to the rollback and the revaluation. So if you take all the residential property combined across the city and compare the taxes they paid last year to the taxes they paid this year, it's up about $56,000. So when you think about the amount of property that's in residential and being up just this amount, that's more or less flat from year to year. Though some taxpayers will see their bill go up slightly. Commercial property gets full advantage of that reduction in rate because their rollback remains fixed. This change in rollback is due to changes in class and also the multi-residential. So if you look at their taxes as a class being up $262,000, that's actually quite a bit less than just what new property would pay. So if all else were equal and there was no changes in the tax rate, we would collect $407,761 from the new property taxpayers. But we have a reduction in rate. So the existing taxpayers, the ones that were on the rolls last year combined, will actually pay $145,529 less. In industrial property, very similar, only a smaller volume of properties. So combined industrial property that paid taxes last year is actually down $93,000. Similar for utilities and similar for TIF. So we'll move on to kind of talk about the valuation by type of property. And I think kind of good news here is we've had this, how the valuation is spread across the different classes. And this is taxable value. When this changes drastically, it makes a shift in who's paying the property taxes. So as we had talked about earlier, we had, we have fairly even this year. So we've had years when a class of property might be revalued and theirs goes up quite a bit, or there's a big change in the rollback, which significantly changes taxable value across classes and creates a shift in property taxes. So this year, that shift will not be significant. If you look at taxable value last year, residential was 63.93, it's 63.89, so very small change. Commercial and residential, same thing, very close. Industrial is actually down slightly. Part of that is, you think about the industrial value that has come on, and the biggest piece by far was Barilla, and that's in a TIF. So only the debt service, a portion of that is subject to these taxes. So not a big change there, so that's good news. So now you pull all that together and look at the impact on the taxpayers. And this spreadsheet takes a look at tax levy last year at about 10.15, tax levy this year, which has gone down, again, about 27 cents or 9.87. And we try to look at how that will impact taxpayers compared to last year. As Steve always mentions, if you just look at the rate, that is just one factor. And I think what the property taxpayers don't write a check for the rate. They write a check for the dollars that equates to. So that's their area of concern. So we try to be as transparent as possible and provide people with as much information as we can of the dollar and cents impact of the services that we're bringing forward in the manager's budget. So if you're a residential class of property and you were revalued by the average amount of the class, your property value would go up about 1%. So it would go up, if it was 100,000 last year, you went up exactly by the average of the class, it would be 100,878. Now the real impact you'll have on your taxable value will be on the rollback rate, which went up from 55 to 56.4. So that even if you made no changes, your taxable value is going up from 55,074 to 56,905. If we did not change the tax rate, residential homeowners would have a fairly significant increase in their property tax bill. we are lowering the rate to $9.87. So that means per 100,000 on an average basis, those taxpayers will be up $3.03 or 0.54%. And that kind of translates back to those existing taxpayers paying about $56,000 more, or when you look over the whole scheme of things, more or less break even for the residential. The commercial property taxpayers did have a little bit more revaluation, and you can see that here. On average, they would be up closer to 2%, but there was no change in the rollback rate. It was 90% last year, it's 90% this year, it's locked in. So their value on average would be up slightly, but they get full advantage of that tax reduction, that rate going down 27 cents. So their property tax bills should be down about $14 or $13.93 per 100,000 of value, or 1.53%. Industrial property had a very small revaluation, so they will get almost the full value of that reduction. Those will be down about $24.53 per 100,000, or almost exactly the same number. In fact, it rounds to the same as the percentage of change in the tax rate, down 2.69%. So, averages, there'll be some people above this, some people below. There'll be some residential property taxpayers that have no change in their value. They're actually going to see a little bit of a reduction in their property taxes. There's going to be some that are up by a little bit more than the average. They're going to see more than this $3.03. But for the most part, it'll either be a reduction or a modest increase in property tax bills. Again, that's for the city portion, which makes up about a third of the bill. So any questions so far as we're going along? And this is a slide that we'll get into a little bit more later on, but we like to look at where do those dollars go, and it's a little clearer and comparable from year to year if we just take 100,000 to 100,000. So we break out that $100,000 of value, and that equates to about $557 in taxes, and we'll show you where all that goes to the different services across the city. So this just shows if your value stayed the same. So if you were a residential owner and you had no change in value, your taxes would be down $1.86 or down about 1.33. And for commercial industrial with no change in rollback, they'd be down exactly the change in the levy, or 2.69. So we'll go back to this slide, up $557, or not up, a total of $557 in taxes. So where does it go? Trust me, these add up to $557, and we have it laid out in another chart, but I think a graphic in this format is better. The bulk of that $557 will go to streets and traffic, and the vast majority of that is for debt service over time. So most of our operating expenses for streets and traffic comes from the road use tax. So that's the tax on motor fuel that you pay every time you fill up your tank with gas. The larger street projects are paid for out of debt service, and that's paid for out of property taxes, and that's primarily what's reflective in this bar of streets and traffic. If you look at a combined group, if you look at the protective services, police and fire together, those would be a larger number, but police protection at 134. So each $100,000 value residential, 134 goes to the police protection. Fire protection is $88. Then you move down to the library at 68, Parks and Rec at 34. Remember, recreation has some other revenues, or some of the rec programs, or most of the rec programs also charge fees. But when you think about the parks, there's no fee to go use a park, but there's certainly a cost to maintain those and keep those in condition. General support services at $29. Transit, city is not the biggest contributor to transit, but it is part of our property taxes. So this $27 per 100,000 reflects our contribution to that transit service. Planning service at about $9. Resource recovery, they primarily receive their revenue out of tipping fees that come into their to be processed, but each of the member cities also pays a per capita contribution to that system. And for us, that's $6 per 100,000. Animal control, about $6. Facilities and cemetery, about $3. Stormwater maintenance at $2. That's another example of an area where we have fees. So there's stormwater fees that cover utilities, but also for some of the larger projects, we'll issue debt to get those done in a more timely basis and paid for out of property taxes. So a small part of stormwater comes out of property taxes. The biggest portion, the operating, comes through user fees. Building safety, $1. This is an area where quite often it will be zero or a contribution to the tax levy. It's actually generating net, and it really is dependent on the amount of building activity that's going on within the city. So if there's a lot of activity, they're issuing a lot of permits for larger projects, that could be zero.
Dwayne, quick question.
Yes.
On the library, that you said all these numbers include debt service, right?
They do. That's correct. That's a good point. So
when does the library come off? When are those bonds paid off?
Yeah, those were 20-year bonds, and I don't remember what year. It was spread over a couple different years, and so they've got a fair amount of life yet. The good news on those is if you notice, when we issue bonds, there's a year that we can refund those bonds without paying a premium. So if you refund them earlier, if the par value is 1, you have to pay 101 or something like that. So they're getting to the point where we can refund those at par. So we'll be looking at those, and when we bring you the debt, we'll have to hold a public hearing, a pre-levy hearing. That's all part of the budget process, and we're evaluating that right now, and we'll include a refunding of those and any other bonds when we get to that on the 9th and 23rd of February, and then we'll actually hold the hearing and approve the bonds on the final session on March 9th. So they're going to be out there for a while, but we could possibly reduce that number. I remember we did a lot of refunding last year. That really helped. That debt service was down $35,000 this year. That's pretty rare, and a portion of that was due to, I think we refunded 3 issues this year and had a lot of early savings on that.
And the new ladder truck, that's in fire protection, right?
That's correct. Yeah, their debt service, their net debt service. We have a contribution from Iowa State that's in there. Also, the radio system, a fair amount of that. And that's not a huge amount, but that goes into these protective services also. Parks and Rec, I think they have a little bit of debt left, possibly for Ada Hayden. I'd have to go back and look. I believe the pool is paid off now. But any amount we would attribute back to these different service activities.
So in summary, besides the library, and really that's the big one, we don't really have a whole lot of debt that's going to be retired in the next 5 to 10 years. That would really help drastically reduce the cost of city services per category. Is that correct?
That's correct, because most of our debt, the vast majority, we issue fairly short. 12 years seems like a long time, but in the scheme of things for municipal debt, that's considered a fairly short issue, and we get those turned pretty quickly. That really helps our rating, and it ends up we never have we're never kind of stuck with a whole lot of debt outstanding. Library, obviously, a different issue, very long-term building, big project. It made a lot of sense to issue longer bonds on that.
Thank you.
Steve mentioned utility rates, and really, in addition to property taxes, that's just one area, and that's not our biggest source of revenue. And wanting to, especially given these times, hold things as flat as possible. So there's very minimal fee increases included in the budget, and we'll hit those as we go through each of the departments. But the big ones are the utilities, so we wanted to talk about that briefly. And these rate changes are reflective of the 5-year CIP. The plans are in place right now. And the biggest portion of almost everyone's utility bill is electric. And good news on that, as we're looking at the current CIP and the situation with electric, we believe we can go through the next 5 years without a rate increase in that area. For the current upcoming year, as Steve had mentioned, the only utility that we're looking at a rate increase is water at 6%. And that is 2% less than we looked at our projections last year. I think we're usually pretty conservative when we look out. And if you look at water going out these next few years, we've got some really small increases at 2%, a couple larger increases as they do some larger projects going forward, and the same thing with sewer. So, I think it's fairly obvious as these are layered in, when we have a small increase in water or about 2%, that's the year we would have a sewer increase. And then the years that we're looking at a larger increase in water, will make no change on the sewer. So we're trying to kind of layer those in over time. Storm sewer, we've got in here at a 5% increase, but remember that's an ERU rate that's at, I believe, $4.95 right now. So a 5% increase is like a quarter on that rate. So, it's not much money for the storm sewer rate, but it would be about a 5% increase. That's what we have projected right now. Resource recovery, we've got a little asterisk in this year, and that's because we're not changing the per capita rate, but we'll be applying the new census numbers. So for the member cities, even though there will be no change in rate, that cost to them will be going up, and correspondingly the revenue to the resource recovery system will be going up. Even with that, we believe we need a tipping fee increase out in 22, 23, going from $58.75 to $62.50. But as you know, they're doing a quite large study on that system, and that it will likely drive what we may need to do with rates going forward. But current status of the system, this is what we're looking at for rate changes.
Couple of questions on the resource recovery rate. This is probably a question that may not be able to be answered, but then for Steve too. We're really uncertain what Ames's census results are going to be because of the timing and COVID, and did we capture all the students or not? What's being used for projection for the 2020 census for the estimates, and how might that affect the per capita rate? Would it go up? If our numbers are down, will we use those actual numbers that we get from the Census Bureau? Does that make sense? Because instead of being at 65, what if we're at 60 or 58 because we didn't capture all the students? And maybe that's a more complex question that really warrants further discussion in the future, but I'm just curious of how you factor that in.
You want to go ahead, Steve? Or?
Oh, first of all, so what did you project for the population? Do we make
we got numbers from Kelly, and I don't remember exactly what they were. Do you have it, Nancy?
No, I know that originally resource recovery was using a higher projection, and then I think as the mayor said, based on the possible effects of COVID, I believe that the projections that they used for population, they did use more conservative numbers. So we based the revenue on the more conservative numbers times the current per capita rate. So it could change. I think when they will bill that at the end of calendar year 21 will be the first time, and they'll use, by then hopefully we'll have the actual census numbers that we'll use. So it might be a little bit different than what we projected, but I do think that the projections were more conservative than what they were going to be originally.
But it's not just the tipping, the per capita charge. It'll be not only what our population goes up, but how about the rest of the county? You see, we could we could go up and you'd think, oh, we're going to pay more, even if you keep the per capita the same. But if they go up an equal amount, percentage-wise, it could all shake out. So it all depends on that. But we could be short altogether, and that's why, it's important that we're conservative and have a balance available because of the uncertainty of 2021, 22, and for a variety of reasons. One would be this, other would be the ongoing impact of COVID, as I've warned the council. We're uncertain if we can get past next year. So we'll need a balance to handle some of these financial blows that may come our way.
Yeah, I was thinking it'd be more the latter than the former that you just talked about, that our numbers wouldn't be up, but potentially they would be down, and how that might affect the per capita rate and how it might affect our neighbors also if we're, anyway, it calls for speculation.
In that case, we'd be short revenue. That's why we want balances to help us maybe bail out this fund if we have to.
And then the other question is, I presume that John Dunn will talk about the projects and rationale for going up 9% in 23, 24, and 25, 26. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, he has a long-range financial plan.
Well, I'll just defer. I'll wait till he makes his presentation.
Again, we're showing you these. I always get scared because it's so far out. They could be more, but many times they're less. So we want to prepare you for the future, but I don't want to be held to these numbers. So it could be better news, but he can tell you why over his financial plan. And you remember on all these utilities, we're covering the operating costs, the expenditures for capital improvements, and then also we've been trying to build up those available balances. Remember, we have a higher target for available balances in the water and sewer fund, trying to get it up to 20% or so. So that takes time to build that up. We've never had that larger balance, but he'll go over that with you.
So are we assuming that whatever changes might occur with resource recovery because of the study that's being done, that those are not going to impact the rates for electric?
No, let me emphasize, the rates you see before you are based on the current capital improvements plan and operating projections. So we're engaged in a study right now to look at the next generation of our waste to energy effort. That will affect both the electric utility and also the resource recovery utility. So if in fact there's some drastic recommendation or an expenditure of $40-50 million for some new or different facility, all bets are off in terms of these numbers for electric and resource recovery. There may be substantial increases to accomplish that improvement. So we'll obviously have to tell you the impact of the cost of these recommendations, and you'll make that decision. But the impact will be the electric utility rates and the resource recovery rates will probably go up. Not shown in here yet, not reflected there. Quite frankly, you don't see, and when we went back to the debt service that Dwayne showed you before, the debt service isn't in there for any of those 4 projects I mentioned in the capital improvements plan that you have not okayed yet. Another, the indoor aquatic center is not in there yet. Any of the 2 fire stations we've talked about are an animal control shelter. So as we get closer to deciding if we're go or no go on that, then we'll layer those on. And the capital improvements plan may be modified for the future to soften the blow of those, adding those additional requirements. Good question.
So John Dunn will go over the impact of those rates a lot more extensively. Well, there'll be a couple different opportunities. One, when he presents his budget on his budget night, but also, we're just talking about a percentage change in revenue. You'll actually have a rate ordinance that comes forward, and that breaks out the details of this. But we've prepared a couple samples of the impact on some of the more typical bills. So the 6% increase in water, we look at that at a median use residential. Again, with electric being the largest portion of the bill, that 6% rate increase will result in about a $1.62 increase in the monthly bill, or about 1.17%. On a median use commercial property, and again, they're using a lot more electricity, so that has a bigger impact on their bill. They would be up about $31.60, or about 0.47. And we worked up several more examples when you actually see the rate ordinance and take a look at this.
But see, the important factor here is everybody gets excited when they see a 9%. I don't want anybody going away thinking that your utility bill is going to go up 9%. When we talk about 9% or a 6% in water and sewer, it doesn't even have that. It doesn't come across as the 6% increase in your bill. You see that, you see. So it's still high, don't get me wrong, but I don't want anybody to be confused thinking their utility bill is going to go up 6 or 9%. It's when you raise your electric bill, as Dwayne said, has the bigger impact on all of it. So again, that new waste energy facility will have a major impact on their utility bills if we go that way. Any questions on that? You have another examples, Dwayne, or is that it?
No, I just prepared these two for today. Yep. I don't want to steal all of John's thunder.
Yeah, John will give a lot more examples for you.
Yeah, he'll have a much more extensive. I would like to point out there's several more items in your in the packet here, the special reports packet, which again is out on our website if anybody wants to look. But several of these you've seen before. It's the things like the minutes from the town budget meeting, but there are a couple items that would be new. They're just distributed. First, there's the Park and Rec rates, and I'm not sure if you've received the minutes from the Park and Rec Commission, but those are in here, and we're looking at some modest rate increases, which is not uncommon for the park activities. Another item which you haven't seen before is on page 41, and if you want me to pull that up, I can, and that is something that some years we don't prepare, but you always ask for it, so I just started preparing it. And that's the estimated impact of abatement on property taxes. So that's, kind of somewhat busy spreadsheet where I get information from the assessor on all the different forms of abatement, some that you have some control over, some that you have none. And we take a look at how that impacts property taxes. And kind of bottom line on this, it's essentially no change from last year. The impact's about the same as it was the prior year. Another item that we have in here, if you remember back in September, you had a workshop on arts and culture. That was a very nice report covering a lot of things and some items going on in other cities. We decided we need to go back and take a look at that a little bit more. So I talked to some of the other cities involved and gathered some information. And obviously, there's a lot of judgment calls as to what's arts and culture. So I tried to put that together on a little bit more of a level reporting area. And again, this one is just for information. Any decision on where you want to go on arts and culture will purely be a policy decision based on the council. But I wanted to give you some information that expanded a little bit on that report that you received in September.
The key part about that, if you looked at it, I know there was some information provided that many of those larger cities gave substantially more towards the arts, but what Dwayne found out when you read the report, a lot of that is because of their subsidy for facilities, which are not strictly used for cultural activities. They're used for tractor pools and conferences and things like that. So it's tough to use apples to apples. So we try to give you an indication of that. So I don't know if you had a chance to read that over. You'll have a chance to read it.
Then we also have the intermodal budget, which I believe you have not seen before either. That's on page 48. And if you remember back, it was like 2011 or 12 when we built the intermodal facility. That was through a grant. But Iowa State University manages that facility for us, but we have an agreement in place where if there's any excess costs that we would share that or we'd actually pick it up. So Steve, I don't know if you wanted to kind of
the contract is such, this is a city facility because it was a Tiger grant, a federal grant. But as Dwayne said, we contract, they have expertise in contracting and managing parking garages. So we contract with them. But the city council and the Iowa State University administration agreed at the time that we would step in and handle any shortfall between their capital improvements and their operations, if there was any. The first 2 years, I think you can see from the attached budget that we have, the city and the university had to split the cost for 2 years for a shortfall. Since that, it's been very well managed by the university's parking division, and they've done a good job. Again, this year, there will not be any money. We'll have to budget based on these projections for us to subsidize. But now we do not want to subsidize. We're trying to build up each year excess revenue so we can build up a replacement fund. When you operate parking garages, you know when a capital improvement is needed, there's substantial costs to improve those facilities. Many times the metal and the concrete and everything becomes eroded, deteriorated, and you may have substantial costs to fix that up. So we've actually built up a fund, or expect to have the fund by the end of next year to be about $225,000. Seems like a lot of money, but it won't be when we have to do some concrete repairs in that facility. So it's on a good trajectory, and the good news is there will be no requirement to budget any city funds, at least according to this budget, to help subsidize it again next year. Any questions on that intermodal facility? Okay, good.
Any questions on the packet or any items you want to bring up? I think the next item we'll go over is some fund sheets, and I'm going to stop the screen share and pull that up. I'll mention that Nancy will go through those, but I'm going to be operating the slides. So if that's not going well, that'll be on me. It'll take me just a second here.
If I have to start going really fast, that means doing things I'm taking too long. So,
Nancy, you're going to start with page 18 or go through the funds first, or what are you going to do?
I'm going to start on, I was going to start on the budget on page 265 and talk about each fund.
Then come back to that?
You want to come back to that in the packet? Is that what you're talking about, or do you want to do that first?
No, go ahead and do the funds first, and we'll come back to that.
Okay, I'm going to share screen.
Okay.
Again, for clarification, it's page 265. Is that what you're talking about?
265 in the budget document.
255 or 265?
265. There we go.
I was on 263, so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So we start as we usually do with general fund. I'm going to just briefly walk through. These are all in the budget document. Just kind of explain some of the high points of each one. And then we do actually have several new funds this year. So I'll point those out. But if anyone has any questions, or if Steve and Dwayne want to jump in and say anything about any of them that I'm missing, please interrupt with questions or comments. So the general fund is the one, of course, that we've spent a lot of time talking about already. That's where we spend for police and fire, library, parks and rec, and the program budget that the departments come up with is what drives how we determine what our property tax rate is. So as Dwayne mentioned, we balance it every year. So in the new fiscal year, in the manager's recommended budget, the revenues will equal the expenditures. If you look on page 267 at the bottom, you will see that how we have it coming down to now is that we will end up with an ending balance at the end of 21-22 of $10,255,214, which will cover our 25% of revenues less pass-throughs, which is our target minimum balance that we want to have every year, and will leave us a $1.2 million, a little over, unreserved balance. Now, we keep $1 million of that in reserve to cover the state replacement money in case something should happen to that funding. And then this year we have a little bit of additional funding in to help with any unforeseen continuation of COVID-19. The I think that the departments did a really good job of being very conservative. As Steve mentioned, it's hard to predict for 21, 22. I don't think that Parks and Rec, for example, went back to a normal year. You know, they still were conservative in what their projections were for their revenues next year, anticipating that it's not going to be a normal year next year, but that there will be some improvement over this current fiscal year.
I would want to point out on the revenue side, in the general fund, if you look at the revenues, the second line down talks about CARES, local government assistance. This is one thing that helped us. Not only do we hold the line on expenditures, but the federal government gave us almost $1.6 million. That was in recognition of our first responders work during the pandemic. It was a category grant. It was not, we didn't have to justify it or submit bills, and it paid for police and fire. So that certainly was unexpected and helped the general fund significantly. And then you can see the hotel motel tax, how it's dropped in the current year. And then we are projecting a little bit of an increase, but not to returning to prior year's levels.
Right.
We may be ambitious here too. I don't know.
Well, when we first were putting those projections together, I believe Dwayne actually had projected 2021 adjusted to be even lower. We were basing it on the last quarter of fiscal year 1920. But by the time we started to put the document together, we had already exceeded what we were originally projecting. So that made us a little more hopeful going forward. But yeah, it depends on the vaccinations and how soon everything returns to normal, because hotel motels was certainly one of the tax revenues that was affected by the pandemic.
So that's the total amount. Remember, the Convention and Visitors Bureau gets 5/7 of that amount, about 72%. So I think over the 2 years, we're calculating they lost about $1.1 million in revenue to date now. So pretty substantial loss.
Steve, how do we, help me remember, how do we use the hotel motel tax that is not passed through to
1% is used to replace lost local option sales tax, but you can't, because you cannot charge both hotel motel tax and local option sales tax. So when the hotel tax went on it, we would have lost the local option sales tax. So it replaces that. So it goes back into the general fund, the 60% of that 1% for property tax relief, and then the other 40% of it goes into our community betterment. And then the other 1% is used for economic development. So that's where you pay for some of our incentive money if we have to make deals. Goes to pay for the contribution to the Ames Economic Development Commission, membership of the Convention and Visitors Bureau, things like that. Well, not Convention and Visitors, excuse me, the Chamber of Commerce and things like that.
Just as a note, the projection for hotel motel tax that the Convention and Visitors Bureau was making was relatively accurate. And in the third quarter, which they recorded in January of 21, they were at 42% of the 3-year average for their hotel motel tax receipts. So that's a significant decrease,
right?
And it's projected to go forward at least one more year and possibly into 23.
Yeah, and one of the problems in comparing apples to apples, I believe the Convention and Visitors Bureau is on a calendar year basis, and what we're showing is a fiscal year basis. So we'll have to reconcile those when you try to compare them from their year to our year.
Frankly, I'm surprised that the hotel motel tax revenue isn't a lot less, because it's actually only it's 56% of what the prior year was, and there's no issues whatsoever. So I mean, and boy, the hotel motels have really taken a huge hit. So I mean, on one hand, it's encouraging. On the other hand, I am surprised, but it is what it is.
You mean the prior year? Because you look at actual 1920, it was down to 2 million. You see that it started to drop there the last April, May, June, the last 3 months. So that's lower. you were looking at the adopted at 2.5, which might have been more in line with the average was. So they took a hit at the end of 1920, and then it continued into 2021.
Also, it's even better from a standpoint.
Could be. Now, is our 2 million correct? That's why, we're guessing on this budget for all operations now. Are we going to be normal for 12 months? Are we going to be normal for 6 months? We were optimistic when we started doing this. We may be wrong, but we can only give Convention of Israel what we get, right? And we pass it through. So I'm sure they're moving cautiously and conservatively in their planning. They're planning for next year.
They are, and one of the data points, in case anyone's interested, is that since March of 2020, the hotel industry has been severely hit, losing over $16 million in revenue since March.
So I'm pointing this out because later we'll show you. My recommendation is that we support the recommendation of the Convention of Israel board, which will be to give a $35,000 grant to Convention of Israel Bureau, and then a $75,000 loan. And I have some thoughts, and we can talk about this later. I think the loan stipulation should be, but we could talk about that. But I think we should support this particular group who contracts with us to perform what the council, I think, believes is a very valuable part of our economy here for Convention of Visitors Bureau, Convention of Visitors coming to town. That certainly helps a lot of our retail industry here. So I think it's important we help them out.
Steve, on the Parks and Recreation 19 and 20, it showed actual was 800,000, and what we adopted was double what it was the prior year. And now this year, and then adjusted is 841, which is actually more than what it actually was in 1920. Can you kind of help me understand what was going on there and why it got doubled?
I have to ask Nancy or Dwayne to help me on that number.
Well, I think that you're talking about their revenue, Mr. Mayor.
Yes, yeah, on page 265.
I think the 1.6 in the 2021 adopted would have been what they would have been projecting for a normal year that we would have adopted last year prior to the pandemic. And then the 1920 actuals were so much lower. And I think a lot of that has to do with, they sell a lot of their aquatic center passes in the spring. So when the pool couldn't open, the revenue certainly, dropped off substantially. They are, being very modest, I think, on their adjusted 2021. They still have, some programs they've been able to continue. I think they were projecting when they put the budget together that the aquatic center would be able to open. I think they were still unsure if they thought they would be able to sell season passes. So I think they were pretty conservative in their projected revenue for 2021. Then for 21-22, I think they're assuming, you can see it's lower than the 1.6 that they, typically the manager recommended budget would be higher than they adopted. But they're still thinking 1.2 because they're thinking it's going to take a while for things to return to normal. And Keith can, explain that a little bit better because it will show on each of the budget pages when he goes through his program budget.
Mayor, I could show you the same things happening there. I pulled out the budget. You're looking at the actual amount, that 800,000. It looks like we doubled it. What we had budgeted was $1.6 million for 1920. So again, that's how much COVID hit them in the last quarter. That $800,000 is significantly less than budgeted. And that is because a majority of our revenue comes in from the swimming pool. We sell those passes before the pool's open. So that shows you how much we were hit. They were hit about 50%. They lost 50% in that last 3 months of their revenue.
Got it.
We already budgeted for a higher amount for the next year. For this year, we're coming in less.
And then fire services, is that income come from Iowa State for paying for
Yeah, mostly Iowa State. Iowa State pays for 25% of operations. A little bit does also come in from Mary Greeley.
You remember, Mary Gree helps pay for our first responder. Now we've got a deal to help pay for our EMT status and training and such. All right.
Do you have any questions about general fund?
We're in pretty good shape, we think, to finish this year. Now the whole world could come crashing down if what happens with the pandemic if it gets worse. But again, the interesting thing was how we'll be impacted in the next fiscal year. But hopefully we have some balances that'll allow us one-time expenditures to help us get through if we experience an elongated impact from the pandemic.
Yeah, page 268 and his local option sales tax. This was a fund that actually had good news in it this past year. When the pandemic first hit last spring, we actually were projecting when we did final amendments with you last May that maybe the revenues would go down in this area. And actually, when we got our reconciliation payment for fiscal year 1920 in November, it was actually higher than we'd anticipated. So as you can see, if you look at the adjusted revenue compared to what we had adopted, it actually went from 8.5 million to 10.3 million, which was much higher than we anticipated. So everybody's very relieved that the law was passed that we could have local option tax on internet sales, because I think that's the reason that this fund was not affected like hotel motel tax and some of the other funds were.
Yeah, this is good news for us. People during the pandemic shopped more online, as you know. Wasn't such good news for our local real retail owners, as you can imagine, which impacted our parking fund and such. But because they changed the law, we were able to collect taxes on this we never would have before. We've been in really big trouble if that wasn't in place. But more people were shopping online, and perhaps are continuing to do that. So that's actually good news, because again, 60% of that goes for property tax relief, and 40% of it will be for community betterment projects. So that's good, including human service and arts funding. So that's good news for us.
Is there a figure somewhere of what is collected online versus, or is it not broken down in that way?
Good question. I don't know.
Yeah, we don't have it broken down that way yet from the Department of Revenue. I think they'll eventually get to that.
Okay.
You know, part of the reason we got this big chunk in November is because they were way behind getting this all figured out and allocated out. And we're not predicting 10 million for next year, but I expect in the near future we'll have more information on that.
Okay, thanks.
Is the line for the city council grant program, is that kind of a combination of our human services capital grant program and the possible art capital grant program?
The city council grant program would only be the ones that are the program that Brian monitors, where people apply for the funding. So it'd be like for the Hunter Green Sports Complex and the Historical Society. It would just be those specific kinds of things. The Human Service Agency funding up above would be asset, and then the CODA would be where it says art agency funding. So it should just be specifically the council grant program, which, if you remember, at the budget issues meeting in December, we decided to just, at this point, at least it could still change, but fund the request, which that's why there's the 9.8% increase this year.
Is this what we refer to as outside funding?
Yeah, outside funding.
The third area you approve on Tuesday night?
Right.
Good question.
And will you be reviewing, like under the CIP, you went from adopting 1.9 million to adjusting to 6.4 million.
Yep.
What do we do with that? What would cause that to go up so much?
Those are carryover projects, so it's largely CIP projects that haven't been completed. So if you kind of look up in the details, there's 2.6 million, a little more, in the shared use pass system. you know, some of them are funding for a project, for shared use path. A lot of it is, I think, the Skunk River Trail, where we've been carrying funding forward, and, you know, there's sections that we can't do until we have easements or the land becomes available. So there's almost always CIP projects that are carried forward in that manner. Parks and Recreation would be another one, and local option sales tax. You know, we fund it, and then sometimes it takes them 2 years to get the project completed. So I think those are the two main categories. Parks and Rec is 2.9 million in the adjusted budget, which is significantly over what they adopted, and the shared use path would be the other one that's the major category that there's a lot of carryovers in because of CIP projects. Any other questions on local option sales tax? Hotel motel, this is another one we've talked about. This was one that was, of course, as we mentioned, really hurt by the COVID-19 pandemic. When we did final amendments last spring, when we kind of knew what was going on, one of the things we really worked for was to try to make all of the funds break even at the end of 1920 to what we had projected when we had done the adjusted budget last year. And I think we managed to do it with a lot of great departmental support, you know, as we mentioned, cutting out conferences and delaying projects. The couple funds that we could manage to get to break even were the parking fund, and then hotel motel was another one. As you can just look at, you know, we talked about the revenue and how much it dropped beginning in the last quarter of 1920. Some of the different things that are on here, we talked about like what we use other than what the pass-through is to the Ames Convention and Visitors Bureau, and there are some different things in here this year than we would normally have. As you can see, the two payments, one just a grant and one a loan to the Ames Convention and Visitors Bureau, are built into the 2021 adjusted budget, $35,000 as a one-time grant, $75,000 for a loan. Those are subject to your approval, of course, but we have them built into the budget right now. A couple of other things that are new that you've already approved are the different studies in here for the reinvestment district. That's up under operations, and then down under CIP, there's the $20,000 for the downtown plaza study, and then $22,000 for the indoor aquatic center study. So those are kind of some exciting things that we are using this funding for that we haven't in the past few years. Other than that, I think that it's the typical expenses that we still have funding in here for the internet improvement study also. So we pay the chamber dues, and our economic development is in this fund as well.
So is the internet study, I know that we talked about that before, that could be possibly might be going away, is that correct?
If council decides to go away, just money goes into the balance.
Yes. The money would just stay here and it could be used for something else.
Okay. And then also just a minor typo, but on those under expenses operations, I think it should be ACVB versus ACVD for COVID relief.
Okay. You're right. We'll get that changed.
Minor Scribner error, but it's just let's figure out what's ACVD.
We have so many people look at these and we still miss things like that. We probably got the D from the COVID.
Mayor, if I could follow up on this, I don't recall any council-wide discussion about changing the internet improvement study, although I can imagine there might have been some side discussion. Have I missed something, or are we talking about maybe side discussion?
No, not at all, David. I saw it. I just didn't know. I knew we had money put aside, and I'm not saying that we're going to abandon it. No one's talked. I have never talked about it. I just asked if we're satisfied with what's going on with MetroNet. Is there a need to spend $125 to proceed with a internet improvement study? And that may still be valid too. So there's no discussion. Yeah.
Remains to be seen then. Okay, thank you.
Thanks for asking, David.
We'll use tax fund, and I might let Dwayne talk a little bit about the projection amounts on this. I think we left the adjusted budget similar to what we had adopted.
We did. Typically on this, we get a forecast from the Iowa DOT and also the league does a forecast. Both groups essentially declined to make a forecast in a timely basis this year because of the way things were going on. So we were kind of left to our own. They usually go out several years. But the good news was, both John Joyner and I get distributions from Department of Revenue and DOT on the collections of these taxes. And after just an initial drop, which ended up being a little bit less than we thought it was, they kind of bounced back. So we're showing some fairly modest increases here, but certainly not decreases that that we initially had thought we might get in COVID. So this is reflective of experience and not so much of projections that we typically get from other sources.
And other than that, the expenses are kind of typical. The operations for road use tax is pretty much what covers most of all of the public works operating expenses that deal with transportation, administration and engineering, snow and ice control. It also picks up a portion of finance costs, human resources, facilities, and things like that. And those, the departments, especially that would have been public works, did a great job of holding their expenses to small increases, so only 2.2% increase in operations. And then the CIP projects are similar to what they would be in pretty typical. Actually, they're a little bit lower than we had adopted in 2021. That just kind of depends on what the projects are that they want to use the funding for. And again, as we pointed out earlier, the adjusted budget for the CIP is always higher than the adopted because of the carryover of projects from the prior year.
Yeah, I do want to point out, you can look at the numbers and say, we have a big balance. Why don't we just do a project of 3.5 million? We do a 5-year planning to finance all the CIP items through 5 years. And sometimes we have to carry this balance forward and spread it out over the next 5 years to help pay for the projects that are listed there. So it's not like you could just lift that out and it won't impact the rest of the CIP. We need it to cover it for the next 4 years after this.
What is included under parking maintenance? I see it gets zeroed out.
Yeah, I think that when we did the parking study for downtown, a portion of it was paid for out of the road use tax fund. So that's not, road use tax normally doesn't contribute to parking operations. Normally that's from the parking fund. So that was kind of a one-time thing to help pay for that study.
And what about street maintenance? Is that's different than street reconstruction, or can you just give some examples?
The street maintenance is just the standard operating maintenance that they do year round, where they go out and patch. Yeah, it's not the CIP projects where they do the reconstruction would be down in the CIP section.
Thanks.
So where does parking lot maintenance come from?
Parking lot maintenance you'll see when we get to the parking fund. Anything else on road use tax? The next one is public safety special revenues. This is actually a combination of several funds that we use to track police forfeiture funds, police grants, police donations, animal shelter donations. Fire didn't used to have their own fund, but they actually had a couple of grants recently, so we did actually I set up their own fund for them to track theirs. They had, as you might remember, the grant from to do their training facility. So they have their own fund now too. So this is just kind of a combination of those things that show in their operating budget that are actually funded outside of the general fund. But they're revenues that are targeted for specific purposes, and that's what they need to be spent on. The citywide housing is the first.
Sorry, question on animal shelter for the adjusted is almost 100,000. Is that for some of those projects we did to take care of some of the kennels out there?
Yeah, kennels was part of it, and then I think a couple of building maintenance things that they were doing too, just to keep the facility going while they're evaluating what to do in the future.
And also the new cat, we brought in a
The trailer.
Trailer.
for a cat housing area. So it's a popular facility, and you'll see a lot of that as donation. Much of the balance you see there is because of donations to the animal shelter.
And then citywide radio system, are we done paying? Is that all taken care of?
That line should have probably been taken out. We did, I think, originally we thought maybe we were going to get a grant here that I think it didn't ever actually come to be. So I think we had a amount in the adopted budget or adjusted budget a year or two ago. So yeah, we should have had that line removed, but because we never did actually have grant funding, instead it was paid for through GO bond.
Right.
Anybody else have any questions? The citywide housing, this is the first of Vanessa's. This is her funding sources with money left over from when they used to do the countywide program. She uses this for a variety of things that she can't use CDBG funding or home funding for. One of the things that she is using it for this year, so is that she was paying for her part-time. She had two of her former employees come back and work part-time to help administer the money that we're getting for COVID-19 relief through the CARES Act. And so some of their salaries were coming out of here, especially at first when we didn't know for sure how much funding we were going to get. We wanted to leave as much as possible for to use for the program. I think now that we know that we're probably going to get state funding as well in a second round from the federal government, some of the salaries will instead be paid going forward from out of those grant fundings that we receive. Also, a small portion of Vanessa's salary is paid out of this fund as well. And we have the next two are the Community Development Block Grant Program and then the Home Program. You've heard a lot about those from Vanessa. Kind of the main emphasis of those this year and next year will be the State Avenue project, Baker subdivision, and that's what a large portion of her funding is being used for in 2021. For 21-22, we never know at this point what the allocation is going to be for these programs. So Vanessa traditionally budgets what she received in the 2020, the current year, for the next year. And we do have, after the home program, we have a couple of new ones that we haven't had before. One is, this is the federal portion, the CDBG COVID-19 CARES Act funding. And you can see that the initial allocation was $354,000. Now we believe that we're going to receive approximately another $356,000. We can, I think Vanessa has the freedom to design those projects as she wants to, or as the city feels what direction we should go in. So we didn't break out what the operational expenses are going to be. We just have the two funding sources. The CARES 1 funding, I know we've been using largely for utility relief, also for rental payments and for mortgage assistance programs. Then this would be the state portion that we're always also going to receive of $604,000, which will, Vanessa refers to as CARES 2. So she'll go over this when she does her presentation next week, but it's just we're allocating it into a separate fund so that we can track the funding and then for use of it. Employee benefit property tax, this is the one that Dwayne talked about when he was doing the tax levy. It pays for the police and fire retirement contributions. So property taxes come into this fund, and then we transfer the funding to the general fund to cover the cost of those benefits. And then the police and fire pension is the fund that we all know has been being used over time to help offset some of the increases in the police and fireman retirement system. And as you can see, we're projecting by the 21-22, the ending balance will be down to $164,000. It's been a very well planned out process for how to use that funding to mitigate the effects of the pension increases. Parks and Recreation donations and grants is where they receive donations for specific projects. We always keep them in a separate fund so we can track how the donations are used. We also have in this fund every year we get $3,000 from ISU for the Moore Park farmland. That's in here. That's accumulating to be used for a project at Moore Park at some point. So one of the most significant ones probably in here this past year was we did get the donation from Bob and Tahira for Tahira Park. You can see that down under CIP, that $50,000 donation to go toward the that new park. And we did have some undesignated donations that we did also do toward the homeless clubhouse in this fund. Another new fund is, this is the fund we set up for our FEMA claim for COVID-19. You can see what the expenses were for in 1920, about $99,000 in expenses for everything from lots and lots of receipts going through for hand sanitizer, but also plexiglass and protective measures for in offices and just all kinds of things. And we have it broken out here kind of by which departments were spending money for things that were deemed to be FEMA eligible. And then in the current year, we have what the expenses are approximately so far this year. And we budgeted kind of based on what the expenses were. I think there's a few that are ongoing. Dwayne might have more to add to that. I think once we got past September 15th, it's maybe only for the public safety.
Yes, that's the prime. So the bulk of our expenses, as Nancy mentioned, were for the barriers. So remember when City Hall was closed to the public, we used that time to prepare to open safely and incurred a lot of expense. And FEMA went from really nice FEMA right after COVID started to kind of regular FEMA. And starting September 15th, really limited what you could spend related to COVID for local government. So public health groups and areas that were more directly impacted, they are going to receive the bulk of the funding going forward.
But these are all that, the original expenses would have been in department's operating budget, and then we moved them when we knew that they were eligible to a separate fund, and they should be reimbursed 100%. And then the next fund is a similar thing. It's FEMA, but for the derecho expenses instead. And yeah, you can see that was a very expensive event, and the bulk of it, of course, was electric services at $990,000. But these are expenses that we all are determined that they will be reimbursed by FEMA. And if anybody has any questions, we'll go on to library. Library has a number of special revenue funds that are just segregated for specific uses. The first is library direct state aid. We broke this into a separate fund for them because they have to do a reporting on it every year, and they use it for a variety of things. A lot of it they use for youth services and for books for the Books for Babies program. The next one that they have is Library Friends Foundation. This is the money that Friends gives to the foundation based on they have a plan always every year with the library for what they're going to fund. Some things that are traditionally in here, of course, is Project Smiles funding. They typically do a lot of program support for things. They buy collection materials. It's actually the balance is going down because for a number of years we had quite a large the Project Small Talk funding was in here too, and that program has been discontinued. They do have some additional funding in here this year because they are going to help fund some of the internship programs at the library to help reduce the cost of the general fund. Library donations and grants, these are kind of their miscellaneous grants that they have coming in every year. Harrison Barnes Reading Academy, of course, is an ongoing one. We still get some Project Smiles donations. But it's just more miscellaneous, and you can use them for specific programs that they want to use the funding for. And then the Library Future Needs is a fund that when the library project, renovation project was closed up, yeah, I don't know if you remember, there were some savings. The project actually ended up coming in a little bit less than we had projected. We had a lot of donation funding for it that wasn't completely used. And so that remaining balance was moved into the Library Future Needs because at Lynn Carey at the time, the library director felt that if the donors would have preferred that was their intent. And so we moved into a separate fund to hold for a future need. Probably a large project at the library, but it's up to the discretion of the library board.
And Nancy, one question. So has the library been able to realize any savings because the facility has been closed? I
don't believe that they budgeted that way. Their staff is still working, to my knowledge, and I say budget is very flat. So I would say that they had some savings on things like conferences and things like that, like most normal departments. But I think that a lot of their staff is still working. And yeah, I think that was probably the better place to see it than these funds would be when Sheila does her presentation, and you'll be able to see their program page.
Yeah, my question isn't prospectively. My question is because of the facility being closed. My question is: are there any ending balances that result from the facility not being open?
The library, I do think that they had some savings at the end from their regular budget at the end of fiscal year 1920 because they mostly, I do think, because they didn't travel to conferences. Some of those might have been from the facility not being open. I think they did cut back on some of their cleaning and things like that. But I can look and get you a number.
You can look on page 166. Look on page 166. You can see what the adopted was versus the adjusted. It's down a little bit. Now, I don't know what they did at the end of 1920. We'll have to ask Sheila that. I don't think they realized as much savings as you might have imagined of being closed or unlimited. Although they had limited hours, I think they had full staff running. So,
okay, thank you.
I think some of the smaller special revenue funds that we have are utility assistance. This is one where we do the project share donation for the utility customer service. We also have the alternative energy donations, which we always get a few every year. And these are used, to help people out through the project share program. And at the bottom of the page is miscellaneous donations, which sometimes if we have public art donations, we'll put it here. There's a little bit of balance in here from when we used to sell bike licenses. Kind of the new thing this year is we did set up a separate fund because we're the managing the Metro Coalition member dues now. So you'll see that there's member dues and then an expense for paying the Metro Coalition expenses. So that's kind of a new thing for this year. And developer project is where we hold funding if we have a developer deposit for a future project, a turning lane or a shared use path. There hasn't really been any activity in that for several years, but we are still holding a balance in several different developments for future projects. Economic development, this is the fund where we have some balance there for if we need to do a local match for any economic development loans. And tax increment financing, this one I had to ask Dwayne about 3 times so far this year because I'm so used to seeing it as a negative balance, and I was so shocked to see that it had positive balance at the end of the year. I kept thinking that it must have been a mistake. But there's a couple of factors for why. First of all, the debt service for the South Bell tip dropped off, but that was pretty minor. The main reason that we have a positive balance now is because we're collecting more on the ISU research part than we're paying in debt service. So we actually have a positive balance over time. That funding that we're receiving now will be used to pay down their debt service. So then it will go back down over time. These should level out to zero. I think that's the last for the special revenue fund. We're going to go on to the capital project fund.
Nancy, back on the special revenue TIF.
Sure. I
see that the state replacement tax under revenue got dropped from 2021 and 21-22. Can you explain the reason why?
Yeah, when we claim that TIF, we just claim it as taxes, and then they figure that all out, and so it'll get split out between property taxes and state replacement tax. But when we actually make the claim for TIF, we have no idea or not really allowed to split it out. So it'll come in that way.
Yeah. So special assessments is the first of the capital project funds. And this is when we discussed a project and we're paying the debt service on it. And then over time, we collect the assessment. So similar to the TIF ones, this is typically in and has a negative balance until we've received all of the assessment revenue over time to offset that debt service. The next one is the street construction fund. This is where all of the outside funding for street, traffic, shared use path projects appears, grants for any of the CIP projects. So you'll see this funding source in the CIP quite a bit. We budget the revenues to match the projects that you can see in 21-22. There's always a little variance in the adjusted year because projects are carried over and maybe the funding hasn't been applied for yet, but over time the revenues should equal the expenses in this fund as well.
Nancy, what is the 40,000 from Iowa State University in 2021?
I believe maybe it was part of a signal that they were supposed to help pay for. I'd have to run the report and look. I can find out and let you know.
Would that be at Beach and Lincoln Way, maybe?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but yeah, I can find out and let you know what it is.
And the reason for the 14.8 million for street MPO is that just from the income from sale of bonds for the South Grand extension?
The street MPO and grant funding is for a lot of different projects. So it could be Grand Avenue if we have any grant or MPO money for any of the street projects that would show there. And airport construction, these are for the CIP projects at the airport. We have FAA funding. Sometimes we have grant funding as well. We do transfer the income from the airport farm here from the general fund to this fund at the end of every fiscal year, and we use that as to fund the local match that we need for these projects. So as you can see, that's got a substantial fund balance to cover our local share at the current time to cover the CIP projects that Damien has projected. Park development, you'll see this one dropped, but there's a reason for that. We've traditionally had the Winokur donation in with the park development funding. And I spend a lot of time every year explaining how much of it was park development and how much was the Winokur. And Keith and I would spend time doing the projections and how much of the interest should go to park development and how much of it should go to the Winokur donation. And so this year I just broke it into two separate funds so that we could track the interest and the expenses for the various park development projects a little bit better. So this is now just strictly park development funding. As you can see, one of the most significant things here is that there's a general fund transfer in of $600,000 in 2021 coming from the one-time balance that we have in the general fund to help restore this fund. This is the fund that had been typically been reserved for just kind of larger projects, but then we had pulled funding out of here too for shortfalls in the homeless clubhouse especially, but also for the Ames Grove restrooms and the First Light restroom project. So we wanted to restore the fund to a balance so that it's available for other projects going forward. So we thought that was a good use for the balance that we ended up having in the general fund at the end of 2021. Then the next page, you can see the vinegar donation now on its own, and that's the current balance in that fund and what it's projected to be for the end of 21-22. Council priorities, capital fund.
Nancy,
Okay.
just to clarify, the $600,000 that we see listed on the recommended use of extra savings from general fund,
Yes.
or the park development fund would show up here, assuming that we're approving that, right?
Yes, yes. So it's in here. We built it into the budget, but yeah, and that's totally based on, you know, what decisions council made. But it's in here right now, built in, and that's where you can see the $600,000 transfer from general fund out under the revenue.
Thanks.
And council priorities fund, this is another new fund. This was one that was another use of that one-time balance that was available in general fund. So we created a fund to use for shortfalls on other projects or any special projects that might be deemed to be a council priority. And bond proceeds is where the general obligations bond, as we mentioned earlier, that will cover the CIP, you know, for the current year. This is where the bond proceeds, and you can see there's still a balance, pretty significant balance at the end of 1920. That would be because of bonds that were issued and the projects haven't been completed yet. And once again, that's why the adjusted budget for the expenditures is so much larger than the adopted budget. Those would just be projects that weren't completed, such as Grand Avenue. That would be under the street engineering category. I would guess that that's probably the largest portion of that 21 million. And then we have two, what we would call permanent funds or true trust funds. One is the cemetery, the perpetual care fund. So these are funds where we, there's a corpus that we can't spend. We can just spend the interest. So a percentage of every cemetery lot sale goes into the perpetual care fund and has to remain there permanently. So there will never be expenses here. There will only always be some revenue. The interest actually, though, that is earned on this fund is used in the general fund to help with cemetery operations. The other trust is the Donald and Ruth Furman Aquatic Center Trust. This one we need to maintain the original balance of $1 million, but the interest that's been earned on it over time can be used. And just in the last year or two, Parks and Recreation has used a little bit, as you can see. They used $8,500 in 1920. They're going to use a little bit again this year, just for I think they just purchased some amenities, such as maybe some chairs and different things for the aquatic center. Now we're moving into the enterprise funds. These are the funds that we operate as a business. The first one, of course, is the water utility, and John Dunn will spend more time on all of these, so I won't go into a lot of detail on it. But as we've mentioned earlier, there's a 5-year plan, so you're seeing just what we're recommending for 21-22. When we actually put the plan together, we have all of this laid out for over the next 5 years at least. So we have the fund balance at the end of 21-22 at $10 million.
You know, an interesting fact here, people say, weren't we hurt by the COVID on this? And actually, COVID did hurt meter sales. Many people did not return to, many of the students didn't come back to their apartments at the beginning of COVID. So you would think the water usage would be down. Well, an interesting fact is then we had somewhat of a drought condition, and the remaining population used more water during the summer. So if you see that, the metered sales will stay pretty strong even during the pandemic. And of course, that affects the sewer fund positively too. So they offset each other. We were very fortunate.
What's the contracted sale? Contract sales is up like 60%.
I don't know how they break it down. That's Iowa State, or who else is in there?
Yeah, it's largely Iowa State. There's a few, I think, other contracts in there, but Iowa State is the main one.
Wow, there's a lot of money that more than wasn't anticipated. It helped offset some of that, huh?
Yeah, and John,
To CIP, yeah, that.
Yeah, go ahead, Dwayne.
Yeah, if when projects get done, we settle up, and they make a contribution to those. So that might have been something that was budgeted 2 years ago, and when it gets finished, they make their payment.
Right.
In addition to the the operating part of the water.
Yeah, they're not our meter. They're not our rate. We contract for their share of capital improvement for the system, and also the use of water. It's by contract. They're not like a regular customer under our rates.
And the water construction fund is where we need to segregate the expenses and the revenue for the state revolving loan fund funded projects. So that's what you're seeing there. And then we have to set up a separate fund as well for the water sinking fund for the debt related to the SRF funding, and maintain it in a separate fund. So that's what the water sinking fund is. And when we get to sewer, you'll see kind of a similar layout. We have sewer operations, which again, John will go over, and the ending balance once again. Unless anybody has some questions over it, I'll just the unreserved balance. This is one where the balance has been increasing, but we have some large CIP projects coming up in this fund. Then down below, we also have the sewer improvements fund, which is again used to segregate the SRF funded projects. A lot of these are not being used currently by water pollution control. It's for some of the improvements in the sanitary sewer system instead. And then we have a sinking fund as well for the debt for the SRF funding. Then the electric utility, Don we'll talk about this some more. They did a good job. The revenues, as you can see, are projected to be just slightly lower, but their operational expenses, as you can see, were down 4.5%.
Let me stress again, in these utilities, we try to cover our cost of operations and also capital improvements. So we consciously build up balances when we have a rate increase, and we draw those down over a period of time. So these are conscious drawdowns, not to be alarmed. These are planned as we do our 5-year financial plan for these utilities.
And again, we have a sinking fund for the electric utility as well to cover the electric revenue bonds that we're still paying debt service on.
Steve, did the renewable energy credits go away in next year? I see we had like 93,000, then 80, and then, or is that just something that happens in arrears?
No, I think rather than sell those, we're going to keep them for ourselves, and we get credit then for going green. If you sell it, your utility doesn't get credit for it.
Got it.
So we're talking about sustainability. To take credit for that, you can't give it to someone else that takes credit for it. So we lose the revenue, but gain the credits for the utility itself, which people are asking for, more sustainability on our part.
So this is another new fund for this year. This is the Sun Smart Community Solar Fund. We wanted to be able to track the revenue from the sale of the power tax and then how that's used over time. So as you can see, the revenue, we sold $571,000 in the power tax in 1920. We're still projecting another $450,000 this year. The power tax will account for approximately, as Don's projecting right now, about a third of, they'll pay for about a third of the projected energy that we buy from Forefront, from the solar farm. Iowa State will pay for approximately another third. And then our power plant will pay for the other third for our own use. And that's where you can see there's a transfer coming from the electric utility fund into SunSmart for our share of that power. So that makes sense to everyone. That's a new fund for this year.
I understand the fund, but I'm not sure I understand. So the electric service have to pay the developer upfront a certain amount of money in order to do the project? Is that what happened?
Now remember, it's a contract for energy. They sell energy to us. So just like us buying coal or gas. So the system has to pay for that.
Where does the money for the SunSmart power packs go then?
It's right. It's in this fund. So it's like a separate bank account. The money will stay in this fund. The power pack money will just be drawn down over time. Over time, I would expect you to see the fund balance lower. Iowa State and the city will continue to pay for their portions of it over time. But since they sold the power packs up front, that money is all sitting in the fund already. It will just, the balance will draw down over, I don't know, Dwayne, do you remember what we estimated, maybe 20 years?
Right.
Yeah.
In other words, if we would have sold 100% of them, we would have drawn down the energy payment would have just come out of those power packs. But we haven't sold enough, so the system, all of us are going to help pay for that too. It's that socialized portion of it. And then you have Iowa State University paying in and some other entities too, businesses.
Well, maybe Don I can ask Don too, but so we're buying energy we're buying energy from the developer, and in 2021, it's $106,000. It looks like we're going to spend on energy. Is that right?
Yeah.
And so, and then for 21-22, the estimate's 181. So let's just say it's 200,000 a year. That's $4 million over 20 years. So the power packs won't even come close to paying for buying all that energy. I'm confused. I don't understand how this is, because I heard you say is that the power packs are being used to purchase the energy from.
We're short. As you can see, we're well short on that. So let Don explain it to you.
Yeah, we'll continue to get revenue from Iowa State and our utility. So the net for the power packs will just be, a third of that number.
So we're not seeing much revenue from the utility yet, right? Because it just came online.
It's just coming online. Yeah, you're right. In fact, I think we're just processing the first power, aren't we, Nancy? Is that?
Yeah, we're just making the first payment now. So I think $181,000, so approximately $200,000 a year, over the 20 years. I think John's estimating, Iowa State will be paying a portion of it. We'll be paying a portion, and I think he's hopeful that maybe the power pack sales will continue. But again, he'll go over this as part of in his program budget as well.
Yep. We were far short of what we hoped for, but before we entered in, I think the council said, "Go ahead and do it." We know we're going to have to socialize this. No, everybody's going to have to pay for this. The general rate customer, not just the power plant owners.
Parking operations, this was another one of the funds that was really devastated by COVID-19. We budgeted a transfer from the one-time balance in the general fund of $542. That was a very specific amount too, as you can see when you look at the bottom of the page. We wanted the balance to be what our target was, which was 10% of operating expenses. So we transferred just enough from the general fund to hit our target. We did also include transfers to the parking reserve fund to help build up that fund for doing future capital projects. Originally, when we first put it together, we were not doing that, but we thought it was important to continue to build up that reserve going forward. And then here's the parking capital reserve with, we were able to transfer a larger amount in 1920. Part of that was because we had a balance already built up in operations. That was the first time we'd actually made the transfer. We had originally thought that transfer would be much larger than that, but when COVID-19 hit, the impact of that was already felt in 1920. So we lowered the amount of the transfer, and then we've just maintained a similar transfer going forward. Transit operations, Barb will talk about the operating fund here. They received, a lot of, you can see the federal funding amounts in the very top line, how much that's gone up in the adjusted budget. And then again, in the manager recommended budget, it's up 32%. That reflects the funding that they're getting because of COVID-19. So because of that, they were able to hold the funding partners, Iowa State, the government and student body, and us to the same rates that we were at for fiscal year 2021. The Student Government Trust Fund, pretty status quo. I think they in other years we've had some transfers based on money going back to the fund because of grant money that we received, but at this time they aren't budgeting any transfers in or out of the fund. And then the Transit Capital Reserve, as you can see, it had a pretty significant balance at the end of 1920, which has been drawn down. I think that's largely due to we had quite a few buses in the budget that are now coming in fiscal year 2021 instead. I think we just received the buses, some of them this fall. Stormwater utility, we talked about this one, the stormwater utility. This is the funding that we get in from the stormwater fees that we pay on our utility bills. It pays for the stormwater permit program, which is administered through Public Works. It pays for a little portion of engineering in Public Works and some of our stormwater maintenance things. It does pay for part of our CIP projects, but largely the larger CIP projects would be financed through GO bond funding instead. Then stormwater improvements, we have a separate fund for if they have grant funding. I think a lot of the federal and state grant funding that you see here is for the river flooding mitigation project. The Ames Ice Arena was another one that was hurt by COVID-19. They did a good job of really trimming their expenses and holding, I think they had a new approved FTE for this position of 0.75. Rec coordinator that we approved last year's budget. They haven't filled it yet, and they're not planning to fill it until we get to July 1st. And they really held their expenses to try to make the fund as positive as possible. And ICBA Capital Reserve, this is the fund where we hold money for future capital improvements. Iowa State contributes $20,000 each year. The city contributes $20,000 out of local option sales tax. And there's no CIP project being planned for 21-22. And Homewood Golf Course was one of the few rec programs that was not, it was affected by COVID-19, but certainly not to the same extent. Their revenues were probably down a little, but it wasn't impacted nearly as much as any of the facilities that had to be indoors. So their operations here, I think, are pretty status quo. They do have a little bit of that $10,000 in their adjusted budget. That's for a donation that they received to put towards a new clubhouse. And then resource recovery is, if you want to flip down to the final balance, Dwayne, this is the one where we are always watching to make sure that their ending balance is still positive. We project it out and really watch this one. It's kind of one of the, can I have you go back up a page, Dwayne, as we've talked about the per capita, you can see the transfer from the general fund there and the revenues. It's been the same for a number of years because it's always based on the population times that per capita rate. So it was down here, yes, exactly, that line. 522 each year, and now it's 550 is what we're projecting in the adjusted year, and then 577, 500 next year. That's because the billing's done on a calendar year basis. So there will be a half of that calendar year in fiscal year 2021, and then it will be a full year at the new population rates in 21-22. But this is when we were saying, we based it because we wanted to do the budget using the new census figures, but we weren't sure what they were. So it's an estimate. Our debt service fund, when Dwayne went over this, this is the fund where we make all of our bond interest and principal payments. And we do 5-year projection on this as well to make sure that the funding is all available for all of our debt service payments. And then some of our internal service funds. So fleet services, this is just to pay for the operations of the fleet service department. We budget this fund as we do most internal service funds. It's to provide a service to our other city departments. We budget them for the most part to break even, not to make a profit. So if Corey has funding left over at the end of the year, sometimes we will bank that money into his reserve fund to use for future projects and CIT projects at the fleet facility. And this is the fleet reserve fund. This is where departments bank money here for each year so that their operating budgets can remain more level. And then when we actually purchase new equipment, it's done out of this fund instead. So this fund can really fluctuate depending on what kind of equipment is being purchased each year. Information technology, that we have an operating fund. That's what this one is, which monitors all of the data and communications in the city. And again, similar to the fleet one, we balance it to just break even at the end of the year. If they do have any excess revenue, we bank it as replacement money for future technology needs. And the technology reserve is where that funding, both for the departments and for our IT department, is banked to pay for those future needs that we need in technology and to keep the department's operating budget on level. The shared communication system is our MAPS-G that we operate with Story County, Iowa State. As you can see, we've got some new partners as well. City of Huxley and City of Story City have now are contributing a small amount, also the fire department and Mary Greeley Medical Center. But the main partners are the Ames Police Department, Iowa State, Story County, and then the E911 board. And we track the expenses through the city of Ames, and then the partner cities are billed for their contributions to the fund. Risk management is all of our risk insurance, especially property insurance was one of the items that was really a large increase. You can look at that line partway down. You can see that Bill is projecting a 35% increase in property insurance for next year. That was based on just some of the increases he was seeing, jumping from actual to adjusted for 2021, and some of the people he talked to about, how the property insurance was trending. He said it's not anything specific to us. It's a nationwide trend just based on wildfires, hurricanes, and just all of the natural events that are going on nationwide. So that property insurance is in the risk management fund, but we allocate this to the department. So the departments that were really hit by that property insurance increase were mostly the utilities. It would have been the electric utility, and both the water and the sewer utilities were affected by that. And then health insurance fund is where we're a self-insured fund. We collect premiums from the departments, and then we pay the claims through Wellmark. And we always have a meeting at the beginning of the year to determine what we think the projected paying for the increase should be for the department. And as you see, then we really project out to make sure that we're maintaining an adequate balance to cover claims in that fund. So we have it pretty much budgeted to break $242,000 difference, which for us we think is pretty level and it fluctuates greatly just depending on how the claims come in, and but I think we all feel comfortable with the rate increase that we projected, and that the balance is adequate in the fund going forward. I think that's it for the fund. Anybody has any questions?
Any questions for Nancy, Steve, or Dwayne? Doesn't appear so.
Great. I think Steve wanted us to talk about something in the reports packet. Dwayne, if you want to bring that up, which is the how we got the balance in the operating fund in the general fund, Dwayne, or Steve, is that the one you wanted me to go over?
I just want to go over the list. I think you have a page 18 is important for you to look at. We could go over it, but it explains, I like this page they've developed on where the additional $590,000 I'm asking for our new property taxes will be going to. And we can go over that, or you can see it. It's a format we've used before. I don't know if you've looked at it there, if you have any questions.
Yes, this is one that we put together just to explain why we need that $590,000, and I try to kind of break it out by category. So our revenues are down a little bit. Most of that is because of hotel motel tax revenue, which that's offset because we transferred that money straight into the hotel motel fund, so there's an expense that offsets it. But I like to show it just so that it's not just lumped into other revenues and you wonder why that number is so large. But overall revenues in the general fund are projected to be down $242,000. But then expenses are up. The total change in expenses is $219,000. So the additional amount we need just for the general levy was at $462,563, which would have appeared on Dwayne's sheet earlier showing the tax rate. And most of that, as you can see, is personal services. You know, we have a 3% increase in salaries built in. We, in the general fund, we only added one new FTE. That's not, you know, the last few years we typically added maybe a new police officer and a new firefighter as well. So that's lower than normal. There was a large decrease in the temporary salaries and benefits. A lot of that is attributable to Parks and Recreation. Health insurance, we budgeted a 5% increase for the department. And the police and fire contribution are $176,000. That's partially because of the increase in the contribution rate, but also just because of the salaries are higher also. The contractual services, you know, I think the departments did a good job. They lowered almost every other category. You know, contractual services are down substantially. Commodities are down. We don't always have a lot of operating capital in the general fund anyway. Typically, maybe some for Parks and Rec, for the community center, for gym equipment. That's the more typical thing in here. But we're down. I don't think we have any operating capital in the fiscal 21-22 budget. Does anybody have any questions about this, or does it make sense? Then at the bottom, we have the additional amount needed for the other levies, which then as a total make up that $590,000 that we need in additional tax revenue.
So the additional amount needed in general levy employee benefits, those don't correlate to the 907, 219. Those are actually pulled out. For example, the police and fire retirement contributions, that is coming from that goes into the employee benefit levy. Is that correct?
Are you talking about the 176, 496 for the police and fire retirement contribution?
Right. I'm just trying to track where the 462, 563, the 161, you know, those numbers in bold down there. Where do those come from?
Okay, so the 462, 563 is a total of that we need the additional because of the revenue being down 242,634 and expenses being up 219,929. So So that's just all of the general fund activity overall. That's the additional amount we need in the general fund just to cover operations. That's the increase in the additional money we need in the general fund and the general levy. The employee benefit levy is just, that's what would come into that employee benefits fund just to cover the police and fire retirement. So that would be in a separate fund. That would be the separate levy. The $1,795 is the additional amount we need for the transit levy for this year. And then as Dwayne talked about earlier, we actually need less money in the debt service this year. That's why that rate dropped. That was the additional amount that we needed there. So these amounts should all correlate to the page where Dwayne had the levies broken out and how much additional money we needed, and to come up to that $590,011 that we needed. I think Dwayne's flipping back to that page. Yep, there it is on the bottom right here.
Well, I guess my question is that can you go back to page 18?
You're asking why is it showing up in the general fund?
Yeah, it says that police and fire retirement contributions is $176,000.
Right.
I thought that police and fire was in the employee benefit levy. Is there actually multiple?
No, we pay for it in the general fund. So when their salaries are paid, it's from the general fund. Then the property taxes are collected in that special revenue fund for the police and fire levy. And then that money is transferred into the police and fire fund to cover those contributions. So if you look at the fund sheet for that, police and fire, for the employee benefit property tax, you'll see the property taxes come in and then there's the transfer into general fund because the salaries are actually paid in the general fund instead. Does that make sense?
Program budget, so you're going to show the expenditures in the police and fire budgets.
And it doesn't correlate exactly. The employee benefit levy that we needed, the 161,469, is a little less than what the increase is in the police and fire contributions, partly because there are a few police and fire retirement costs that are not in the general fund because we allocate a few people, like Jeff Huff's salary, for example, when he's not acting chief, is part of it allocated to the parking fund. So there's not an exact correlation there. And then also we did use some of that balance in that police and fire retirement fund to offset, so with the increase, that transfer amount that we needed, the 161,469, didn't have to be quite so large.
Right.
Okay.
See, is the additional FTE and salaries the diversity, equity, and inclusion coordinator?
That's right. As Nancy said in the past, I've tried to build up police and fire officers each year, and that goes to the general fund. This year I defer. Next year I've deferred. I don't have any additional police or fire, and the new position is in accordance with my recommendation for policing. But I want to emphasize that diversity, equity, and inclusion coordinator will not be housed in the police department. As I mentioned, my recommendation will be housed in the human resources department, and it will serve that function for all departments are certainly needed to the benefits from that position. So, and then that position and being in HR is spread throughout all the funds, the cost, because that department services electric, water, sewer, and not only the general fund department. So that's the only FTE I believe I've added this year.
Steve, you mentioned that a lot of vacant positions were not filled this year. Does your budget for the next year contemplate filling those positions?
Yeah, most of those positions have been filled. That's why I'm worried. I don't have what I'll probably do is, remember there were 2 new positions we were supposed to fill this year for police and fire. I'll probably keep those open because we've already filled we've had a number of vacancies, so we're almost fully staffed. But I don't know. I'll have to be lucky to have vacancies if we have a problem. That's why I want to have a substantial balance in the general fund to deal with that if we have a shortfall again, because you can't be assured if you're going to have vacancies next year.
So the answer is yes, you're going to go ahead and fill those vacancies, or virtually all the vacancies that were not filled to save money.
I won't say all of them. Police and fire will, for safety purposes. As you know, I have a management analyst in my department is not filled, and I will not fill it probably until I see what happens well into next year. And we have a half-time secretary position that's not been filled. So that's an example. The non-public safety we may keep open. We benefit mostly from a lot of the public safety positions, those 15 or 16 positions this year that really helped us, and they were kept over for 9 months. But I filled them as of November, December.
Okay, I'm sorry. So you already got them filled then?
Yes. We thought we could do that without jeopardizing safety because, as you'll see from the police and fire budget summaries, during those times when people are home, fire calls went down, a lot of police call demands went down, so we didn't feel we'd be sacrificing anything. And we're still actually have some other vacancies in the police. We're going to be recruiting again in a short time, but I'll probably still keep a police and fire position open, which is about $200,000 to see what happens into next fiscal year. Good questions.
Other questions for Steve, Nancy, or Dwayne?
Let me go into page 20 if I could. That's right, Nancy?
Yep.
So, because of the good work of the department heads, which held the line on expenditures with the vacancies and what I talked about, plus the COVID money that came to us for police and fire and also CYRA, we're going to generate some extra money this year. I've always counseled the city council. These are one-time funds that I would not suggest you use to reduce property taxes because you'll only be short that amount next year, plus the increase in the budget. So I huddled with my executive leadership team, and on page 20 is a list of one-time expenditures that I would recommend, and they have been built in the budget. That doesn't mean you can't change these and alter these. They were rushed together, so I can't tell you in some of these I have engineering costs, but the best estimates we could get. And in no particular order, I don't know if you want me to go through them or you see them or want the rationale for them. I don't know if the public sees them, so maybe I should go through them if that's okay. Just a few seconds. In no particular order, we are going to do some diversity, equity, inclusion training. We've done this over the years with our employees, but we're going to do it next year and the year after, a 2-year program with all employees, including police and fire. But I'm asking for another $40,000 for another individualized training for police officers for diversity, equity, inclusion, in addition to what they'll receive along with all the other employees. So it's $40,000 we're asking for there. We want a new police speed trailer. When we get complaints about speeding, we move those mobile trailers out in the neighborhoods. Have you seen those? They're effective over a short period of time in getting people's attention. We have one now, but it's on its last legs, and we need to replace it. If you've been in the fire stations, we have exhaust systems to protect our firefighters when they turn on the engines before they leave the station. Those our apparatus leave exhaust into the fire station. Those need to be upgraded too. That's $20,000 for all 3 stations, I want you to know. Some of these items, if we didn't have them now, would be placed in future budgets, which would have cost the taxpayer money. So we're using the savings to save the taxpayers money, okay? Now, people have talked about the need. I think the bicycle committee has asked that we have a comprehensive wayfinding and upgraded bike trail signage system. Say that a lot. Bike trail signage system. So to do a comprehensive wayfaring and have attractive signage, we're not talking about the metal signage we could put up. We're estimating about $250,000. Now remember, that could come in less. So I'm just putting a budget amount here now. To increase our service level in the parks for leaf removal, they want to upgrade a leaf vac system onto one of their trucks. That's about $25,000. One suggestion we had to improve the park, dog park, was to allow controlled access. That will allow us, the people who help contribute to the use of the facility can get in there, but also we'll make sure that people get in there. They will have to register for that access card. So we'll have some information about their pets and whether they've been vaccinated and things like that. As you may know, sometimes we have fights among dogs and cats and our dogs, and we want to make sure that they've been vaccinated. So I think that'll be a good improvement. Now remember, we talked about across the street in the plaza having some water features, but that's not our major splash pool. the major splasher we have built in the budget this year, Keith told you about it at a prior council, but because we picked a recirculating system, which is more environmentally sensitive, we need additional $200,000. I placed that and I'm recommending that be used, the additional funds be used for that. Auditorium, we want to put in LED stage lights. That's $30,000. Recently, I think Dr. Pease was talking about his concern about cleaning out our wetlands up at Hayden Park. Remember that? That had not been put into the budget. We can certainly put that in the CIP over a number of years. We could take advantage of this money, $175,000, we think, to clean or dredge those wetlands. One of the ways I saved money for this year was to cut out some of the list of items we had similar to this last year. And you've seen this before. This is the library entry improvements. Those are those large entry doors, which are difficult for people to open, we're finding. Plus, they're not as energy efficient as we'd like because you're opening up a large, massive area when you open those doors to come in. So we have $600,000 earmarked for that. When we came back from a trip to Colorado, we went to Fort Collins. They did a very interesting thing with their transformers, downtown transformers, and I think there were also traffic signal boxes where they had local artists paint those. So they made something ugly decorative and made some fun environment out of those in that area downtown. So the council seemed to indicate, you remember they indicated us they were interested in that. That was actually referred to the Public Art Commission, who's been working on that. And I think they're going to come back, rather than painting it, they're thinking about using local artists to design it, but maybe put on wraps instead, wrapping it instead of painting it. The paint seems to be expensive and maybe doesn't adhere as well. So we're waiting for them to complete their recommendation, and they're going to have to come up with criteria and all, but we never really put any money in there. This is a guess for a pilot program, about $10,000 to start with. I think they want to wrap maybe 5 to start out with. Now, you've also heard about, it dates back probably two town budget meetings about, and more recently about adding some money for a capital grants program. This is more than the $10,000 we're talking about now. And I'm adding a $200,000 request for you. This would be similar to what we did for the human service agencies in terms of dollar amount. But capital would be a broader definition. We don't have any criteria yet, definitions, how much per grant. It's just appropriating funds here, if you'd like, for an arts program to help make Ames weird. Not cool, but weird. Remember that. And then we've talked about additional City Hall parking. Now, this parking at $700,000 does 3 things. It's estimated to be able to pay for parking, that angle parking to the west of Clark Avenue, across from the new plaza. So we'll have parking for handicap accessibility, plus visitors to City Hall. Secondly, this money will allow us to purchase the lot north of City Hall that was purchased by Vanessa. We would have to repay them $200,000, meaning CDBG for that. We acquire it. And then there's money, the remaining money. The third item would be to pave that into a public parking lot, have access to City Hall, but also it would have access to users on the plaza. Now, we also have built in City Hall improvements. What that basically is, we've been here since 1990 with the original wall coverings, which are starting to, as you see, with gaps in the wall material. The need to replace, this would be our second round of replacing carpeting throughout our floor covering throughout the whole City Hall. That's the estimate for that, $450,000. We've already talked about the other 3. To transfer and restore the park development fund is $600,000 I built in the budget. At the time, I had $1 million built in for it could be a variety of projects. It's interesting, and I didn't know this at the time. I'm honest with you, that we're short $1 million for the plaza, perhaps. So you could use that for that or some other project. it's probably wise to use it for that. Otherwise, I would use it for that probably. And then transfer to the parking operations fund. Remember, Nancy went over that to restore that fund. And hopefully it won't get worse for the rest of the year. Hopefully we'll have parking downtown in our business and downtown and campus town. Our business will start to flourish again. So all those add up to $4.5 million, $4.6 million. They're built in the budget. I want to emphasize I'm putting it in 2021, but I don't think we're going to spend it all in the next 4 months. So I know you're going to ask me at the beginning of the year during the adjustment, you're going to say, why is the budget over by $4.something million? This is when the carryovers that will occur. Some of them are important to do. I can tell you that, like the park development fund, you talked about maybe a auditorium sign. It could come out of there. One particular thing we're excited about is what's known as a pitch. You probably don't know this. I'm an expert at this. This is a small soccer field. Actually, Amber educated me to this, but I didn't know what to call it. But we're excited about that, and we don't want to wait 5 years. We can buy it out of that fund too. That fund was established so we would have a fund available in case land came available. We'd have money to respond quickly to it. We wouldn't have to wait through the capital improvements planning process. Our new facilities. It's not meant to maintain some of the existing facilities. So when we fix up a bathhouse or a bathroom or whatever, that comes out of our normal local option tax. So we're trying to build a fund we can react quickly to. There may be savings from some of these, so we've got a lot I hope there is savings. And also, I'm not going to authorize everybody to start spending right away because I want to get into a little bit into next year anyway. I want some carryover in case there's a COVID impact on the finances. This will be a source too. We might have to say, you can't spend this. We need it to make up for lost revenue. I think it's a neat, it's an interesting list. It speaks to a lot of people's needs we've heard, that you've heard. And that's what we're trying to do, respond to some of that. You don't have to make any final decisions now. I just want to tell you it's built into the budget. Any questions on this or the list?
Steve, the mayor mentioned in the State of the Community address yesterday that we are doing that city council training on diversity, equity, inclusion, and policy. And I'm wondering where that fits into this list. We've got the police department budgeted. Are we coming out of council contingency? Can we come out of something else?
I think we need to find out the cost of that, and I'll get a better idea where it should come from. It certainly could start out with contingency. It could come out of a balance, available balance. I don't have a sense of the cost. Does anybody yet on that? I think we need to talk. Well, I hope we talk about this on the 6th. Do you want us to work with the National League of Cities? Do you want us to take proposals? And then we can find out costs. But I think we'll be able to find the money. Well, I should say, I don't think it's hundreds of thousands of dollars, I don't believe. So I think we'll be able to find the money in either the general fund balance still or the contingency fund or whatever. But it's a good point. We need to bring that up and get an idea what we're talking about in terms of money. Again, there could be savings from any one of these items too.
I know in a conversation with Leon Andrews, he indicated that there was some flexibility in terms of scope of training and
right.
And the amounts. So I have some general recollections of some ranges, but I could certainly follow up with them this week and find out, get some general, ranges so we can know what we're talking about. So.
Just so you know, we pursued them to give a proposal for our citywide, employee-wide proposal. At the time, because of COVID, they would rather do this virtually. We wanted somebody to be in person, so they didn't apply, they didn't submit a proposal. But if it's okay for the city council to do it virtually, I'm sure they'll do it at a very reasonable price. There'll be no cost involved for travel and whatever. So I think they could probably do it successfully with you virtually through Zoom, but we should talk about that and see if that's adequate from you. That will certainly hold the cost down for them.
I think it worked well for those of us who participated in the International Town and Gown Association training with the real team. So
Over Zoom? You did over Zoom?
we did it over Zoom. Yeah,
Yeah, good. So you found it effective?
I thought it was. And I have, as a point of comparison, I've done the face-to-face version of that same training.
Have you?
And I thought it worked well. There are
Okay.
a couple things that didn't quite work the same, but it had good value for those of us who participated.
Well, that's good for the mayor to know, because I'm sure that'll be a much more reasonable cost to the city. And if it's just as effective, that's a smart way to go. So maybe we'll find out before the 6th, right? Get a better idea on that.
Yep.
Nancy or Dwayne, is there anything we have to say anything more?
I don't think so, unless anyone has any further questions about any of the materials.
Now, I really want to thank the council for taking the time to do this. I can assure you that not every city slices and dices this big picture the way we do, and it's a credit to Nancy, and Dwayne's developed a lot of these formats. And I know it's a lot of information. It's some information that I think you need to know, and I want the public to know about it. I don't want the budget to be a mystery. So for your patience, we greatly appreciate this. Now, probably the more fun stuff will start next week. And again, I'm trying to emphasize the departments. We'll talk a little bit about funding, but I want to talk about services, what you get for your money. You'll be able to see that and ask questions. Start off with that. But let's make sure everybody's happy with the level of service we're receiving, or if you want to tweak services. And then the tough day will be the next Tuesday, which is the 9th, where you'll have to make some final decisions. Now, you should have in your packet the outside funding requests and recommendation. You should have human services request. Deb's got that, right? And the recommendation room asset. And then also CODA. And then you'll see things like public art and some of those other areas too. So if you have any questions, I'm sure you'll call Deb directly, call Brian before that night. They'll give presentations that night too. There's still time for the public to review all this and give input to the city council. Anything else we can get you before we start meeting? And no, we don't have pizza available for you on our budget meetings. You'll have to heat up your own.
I was hoping you could run that around to us.
Any questions or additional information you'd like from us? Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Enjoy the weekend. Be careful. We're going to get a little ice and snow.
Yeah.
And Dwayne and Nancy, thank you very much. This is really good.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to all those staff members who put in so much time keeping the budget in line with
Yeah,
our.
they do a great job.
Yeah, they did do a great job.
They're on board with us. You don't have to fight with them. They understand what we want and they try to produce. So they need a lot of congratulatory comments too.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Take care.
Okay,
Thanks.
we got a
Thank
couple
you.
things. We got a disposition of communication to council and then council comments before we adjourn.
All right.
Council, we got a email from a Robert Long regarding wanting to rezone the west side of Grove Avenue.
Mayor, I understood that as being part of the non-agenda packet for next week.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, well, the heading on the was for January 29th, 2021 on the email, so.
That's how they're always dated, though. They're the date of when the packet is sent, not when we're taking action on them.
Yeah, I'm just trying to be efficient. We'll defer that to next Tuesday night then. So, all right, council comments. Rylan.
Nope, nothing for me tonight, I guess, other than thank you to the staff for the great work on the budget and the presentation.
Thank you. Amber.
Ditto. Thanks, Steve, and your office and all the departments. Appreciate it.
Rachel?
Nothing today. Just, yeah, thank you to the staff for this really informative presentation, and I'm looking forward to next week.
David?
No further comments, thanks.
Gloria?
Yeah, I have one further comment, and that is that many communities are not in nearly as good a condition as Ames is, and I think that's a credit to our staff. And so thank you to all staff members and to our management team for getting us through this far and projecting into the future.
Okay, I would agree with all those comments also, and I kind of brag up our city staff and our situation when I talk to other mayors in terms of how fortunate we are. There's no one else that would want to go through what we gone through this last year than our city staff, and led by Steve, and Dwayne's done a great job as CFO, and boy, we're just pretty amazing. I just have one interesting update for council, and that is last night, every Thursday night, we have a Story County Emergency Management meeting where we talk about COVID issues. We have mayors from all across Story counties, county supervisors, Iowa State, public health. I'm sure I'm missing a couple people, but it's been going on for now 10 months. And the Story County Emergency Management Director invited a couple people from McFarland Clinic to give an update on vaccinations. And I was absolutely amazed at the plan they have put together. And so I toyed with the idea of calling him up and asking him to give a presentation to you as council, and also so it gets out more to the general public. But their plan, we're now in the next phase of the plan for vaccines, and it includes people who are age 65 and older. And McFarland Clinic has decided what they're going to do is they're going to start with the oldest of their patients and work their way down. And they actually have a patient or two that's 108 years old. And they are starting to call those individuals, and they're just working their way down. Let's see, I'll have to explain it to you. 107, 106, 105, down to 65. And there's like 24,000 65-year-old or older residents in Story County. They're not all McFarland Clinic residents, patients, but a lot of them are. And McFarland is going to call every one of those individuals, not email them, call them to set up an appointment to get a vaccination. They're eliminating all the issues of people trying to go in with this, mass going to a vaccination site. It's being paced with what we have coming in for new vaccines. I was just stunned at the way they're really trying to, and they actually have a graph showing people who are 80 years and older have 50-some% of our deaths in Story County have been 80 years and older. And that drops down from 70-year-olds and then 65-year-olds. And the whole idea is let's get those who are most vulnerable and most likely to die from getting COVID-19, and then work their way down. Obviously, they're at the mercy of the distribution of vaccines, and that fluctuates from day to day in terms of what they're going to get. I think that they're anticipating 100 coming in Monday, and then there's going to be, I think, another 300, 500 next week. But that's also spread to those that are 65 years and older, also first responders. So there's a distribution system the public health is working out. Extremely orderly. But all this is on McFarland Clinic's website. So if you're interested, extremely well done. You can go in there, and for those who are 65 and older, if you are curious if you're going to be on the call list, you can put in your name, birth date, phone numbers, and push check, and it comes back. I tried it last night, and it comes back instantly saying, "Yep, you're on the list. You'll be called when we get down to your age range." So anyway, I just applaud what McFarland Clinic is doing, public health, and it's just absolutely it makes you very proud to be in Story County and know what they are doing. And one of the things that was one of the comments that in the presentation was, we want to do what's best for the community. And I thought, wow, what a really outstanding way to present what the priorities are. It's best for the community. It may not necessarily be what I want necessarily as an individual, but is what's best for everyone in the community. And so anyway, my hat's off to them, and their website is outstanding. And so all the graphs I'm talking about, they're on the website. You can just scroll right through them. They have the slides. They're being very transparent and really trying to help people understand. So if you hear anything, social media chatter or conversations with people, whatever, saying what's going on with vaccines, send them right to that website. It lays it out, very well done. And public health is doing an outstanding job also. So it's a monumental task, and I think I've underappreciated what all the planning is being done, but that became very evident, last night, and it's also reassuring. There is a plan, and they are also getting the information out on social media. I did encourage them to try and get it out in print, through the Tribune, because a lot of people in that age group are more inclined to be newspaper readers versus being on social media or Twitter or Instagram, whatever. So anyway, but again, this is a great place in America to be living and to enjoy the benefits of what people are doing to take care of us. So anyway, so with that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move we adjourn.
Right, Gloria. Everyone have a great weekend, and we will see you next Tuesday night at 5:15.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
See you then.